I think we are on, right? Good evening, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining me for this talk. A small group of you who are here in the sanctuary, and I assume that some of you are watching us from home. When I decided to do it several weeks ago, I thought that I'll be able to cover everything I want to talk about in about 50 minutes. I think that it was super optimistic on my behalf. So I will cover as much as I can today, and if there is a desire, I'll be happy to give a similar talk, or at least a similar topic, much closer to January 20th. And until then, many more things will happen. I personally believe that the next 5-6 weeks will be really, really interesting in the area in Israel, here in the Mideast, because only last week, and I'm going to talk about it later on, Israel assassinated what they call the father of the nuclear plan, the nuclear doctrine in Iran, Muhtar Fakhrizadeh, and that was just a week ago. The Iranians promised to respond to that. And if they do respond, at least in the next 5-6 weeks, Israel, perhaps even the United States, will have to respond to that. So we may have a lot to discuss. More than that, there is a good chance that Israel will go to the fourth election in 2 years, as soon as February or March. But let me begin with how Israel took the results of the American election. There are few countries, especially in the Middle East, who were praying daily, probably hourly, for Donald Trump to win the election. And I'm talking mainly about countries like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia. They did many things that normally would irritate the American president, but Trump, for different reasons, decided not to respond. For example, let's look at Turkey. Turkey was very aggressive militarily, especially when it came to Cyprus, to Greece. Turkey did something unheard of as a member of NATO. They bought missiles, the S-400 from Russia. That is a great violation of everything. Turkey, the level of human rights there deteriorated so dramatically. And they knew that if Biden wins, they will be in trouble. Trump referred to Erdogan, the Turkey's leader, as his favorite dictator or pet dictator. But he knew that if Trump loses, he is in trouble. And after the election, he is working very, very hard to make some changes. I do not believe I'll have a chance to talk much about Turkey, as tempting as it is. It is really important to talk about, but not today. Other country is Saudi Arabia. They also did some things that Biden explicitly said even before the election that he strongly disapproved of. For example, the war in Yemen that killed many, many innocent people. Human rights there, even though they had some reforms, believe it or not, now women in Saudi Arabia are allowed to drive a car and even to walk on the street without a man. Until recently, they had to have a man who is either a relative or a husband with them, and now they're allowed to walk by themselves. Definitely a step in the right direction, but not really enough. And there are some other things that MBS, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Saud, preferred the Trump administration over the Biden administration, and he has to get ready for a tougher treatment. But when it comes to Israel, that's not the case at all. Israel definitely, or at least Netanyahu and his supporters definitely preferred Trump to win. But there was no fear of Biden's win. Biden has been a good friend of Israel for 40 years. When one looks at his record of support of Israel, it's impeccable. He's been to the area so many times. He went there as a private person because of his religious feelings. He has been a friend, and many times he said that he would remain a friend. He is completely against BDS. There were some people on his party, and I will talk more about the left wing of the Democratic Party, who does not favor Israel so much, but he says that he's not with them. One of the last things that President Obama did as the President Obama was not the closest friend of Bibi Netanyahu, but it's important to remember that one of the last things that he did was to sign a bill that promised Israel an annual allocation of $3.8 billion a year. Some people on the Democratic Party said that Israel should get the money, but it should be conditional. In other words, if Israel does something that America is unhappy with, America should take some of this money away from Israel. Biden made it very clear. This money, this allocation is unconditional. Why did they still prefer Trump? Because Trump and his administration were an anomaly in the area. Especially when we're talking about Kushner, when we're talking about David Friedman, who is the American ambassador to Israel. Israel never had such warm friendship, support from any American administration. Now, for the most part, American administrations were good to Israel, almost always preferred the Israeli interest over the Palestinian and other Arab countries' interest. But what happened during the 4 years of the Trump administration, especially, not with the entire state of Israel, but especially with Netanyahu, is something that has never been before and probably will never happen again. So definitely Netanyahu personally has been praying at least 3 times a day for Trump to win. More than politically needed Trump to win, but Netanyahu received a lot of personal political strength from his relationship with Trump. Israel had 3 elections in 1 year. As I said, maybe 4th is coming soon. And during the last 2 years when the election took place, you saw in the big cities of Israel huge posters of Trump, more than you saw them in big cities in the United States before the election of November. Because for Bibi, it was really important to show him always alongside with President Trump, as the slogan that he liked to say, I'm playing with the big guys. I'm up there with him, with them. It's not going to happen after January 20th. Now, Bibi was one of the last Democratic leaders to congratulate Biden. He still believed that somehow Trump may remain president. But here is something very revealing. When he finally did it, he said, I've known Joe for 40 years, meaning we've been good friends. So yeah, Bibi, let's move on. But one of the Israeli commentators said in a very typical Israeli sarcasm, yes, Bibi, but Joe knows you for 40 years. In other words, Biden knows your shticks, and you have to work much harder. So Israel, in this regard, I don't think should worry from any Biden administration. I'm going to say it now just because some of you are probably jumping in the house because I'm not saying it, but I will elaborate much more about it afterwards. The only issue that Israel should be concerned about is Iran. But I do not see any risk for extra pressure, American pressure on Israel during the Biden administration. Main reason is that Biden is not going to have the time, definitely until the summer, maybe even for a whole year, even to think about the Middle East. He has the coronavirus to deal with. He has the coronavirus economy to deal with. He has the race issues to deal with. He has a society in which he got more than 70 million people voting for him, but Trump got more than 70 million people voted for him as well, and many of them think that Biden is not a legitimate president. This is a big issue for him to deal with. And these are just some of the small domestic issues, not small, I'm sorry, the domestic issues. And when he's finally ready to look at some foreign affairs, he has China, he has Russia, he has Turkey. So Israel and the Palestinians are going to be very close, in my opinion, towards the bottom of his priority list. So for him to put pressure on Israel to get to any agreement with the Palestinian, I really don't think it's going to happen. Another reason is that Biden made it very clear that he's a one-term president, and he's been around for way too long to know that he can achieve anything in one term. So I don't think that that's going to happen. Another thing that is good to Israel, and even people from the Bibi camp were quite happy, is when they saw the nominations of Joe Biden. Because the fear was that Joe Biden will choose many people from the progressive camp, right? The left wing of the Democratic Party. So far, he hasn't done it. His Secretary of State is Tony Blinken. And Tony Blinken is a person who is appreciated by all Israeli. Not only that he is Jewish, but he has been raised by a Holocaust survivor from Majdanek. And the book that his adoptive father wrote is a well-known book in Israel that many people read. In many interviews, he mentioned how deeply he was and still is affected by the Holocaust. And if we have to put him on the political spectrum, he is a real centrist. He has no room to move to the left. Okay, so as far as a Democrat Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, they couldn't have had a better person than him. Now, why am I saying it with so much confidence? In preparation for this class, and in general, that's what I do, I read a lot about the Middle East. I normally don't bother with the big networks because I know what they're going to say even before I listen to them, because they always have a very narrow agenda. But when you read what the think tanks here in Israel, in Arab countries, there are some fabulous ones, in Europe, have to say, you get a much broader and, in my opinion, much more accurate, balanced, and fair picture of what's happening. So, when Biden announced that Tony Blinken will be the Secretary of State, few people were unhappy. One group were the left side, the progressives of the Democratic Party, the American Democratic Party. The other group were the Arabs. They were unhappy because they said Tony Blinken is just going to be like the Trump administration. Nothing is really going to change. So when you see people on the far left very unhappy with the Secretary of State because he is a supporter of Israel, you can tell that he is a supporter of Israel. Another nomination that at least Israel decided on, only that Biden has not yet, and this is the defense secretary. There is no defense secretary yet, but the leading name, at least until recently, was Michelle Flournoy. Michelle Flournoy, even though she worked with the Clinton administration and later on with the Obama administration, is one of the biggest experts in security in the world. And she is not just centrist, some would even depict her as a little bit right of center. Okay, definitely good for Israel. So if she is the defense minister, you can see what is the approach that the American administration will be taking while dealing in the Middle East and Israel. So far when you read and listen to the experts in Israel, they feel quite good about it. They are not so shocked. Again, Netanyahu personally is very unhappy, but please remember, I know that for us it's sometimes hard to keep in mind that Israel is not Netanyahu and Netanyahu is not Israel. He has been the prime minister for some 20 years, so people are born and die and have children and grandchildren, and he's still the prime minister. But that's not to say that his personal interest is the interest of Israel, especially now when he has to spend most of his time and energy defending himself in court because he was indicted for some serious corruption issues, and he is not in a good place. Okay, so let me just sum up what I said. The Netanyahu administration was really super friendly, super warm to Israel. It is not to say that many Israelis did not see it as a missed opportunity, because they always like the Americans to put some pressure on Israel in order to push Israel to have more concession when it deals with the Palestinians. But Trump did not do it, and was extremely friendly to Israel. That's not going to happen, but the Biden people are going to be more than fair. I don't think they'll do a lot for the Palestinians. They probably will give them a little bit, because Trump took away from them few things that are more symbolic. Some monetary aid that I believe Biden will restore. He closed their offices in the US, and I believe that Biden will open it. When Trump moved the American consulate from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, he closed the American consulate in Jerusalem, which de facto was the consulate for the Palestinian Authority. So during the Trump administration, there was almost no connection, no relationship between the Palestinians and the US. Biden is going to have some symbolic things, but I'll be very surprised if he will do more than that. So this is just the introduction, the big picture of how people feel at this point in Israel about that. Gali, do I have some questions? No questions, so that's good, because I have so much to talk about. Bob? Can
you talk about the
No, not right now. I have a very clear, Kamala Harris. I don't want to talk about her, because I have to tell you, for this talk, she's not really important right now. And I if she becomes the president, and maybe even in the middle of the term, that will be a different thing. But it's very clear that the leader is Biden, and even if you did not vote for Biden, and half of you did not vote for Biden at least, you have to give him a lot of credit for really knowing the area. He is an expert in foreign affairs. He has been around for all these years, and he's the first president in a very long time who doesn't just start cold. Right? Because think about Trump, think about Obama before him, since Bush the father, right, who knew everything about the region and about the world, he is the next president after him. And when it comes to foreign issues, he is going to be the leader, definitely not Kamala Harris. I just have tons of stuff to talk about. Let me continue with a little story that will help me to move to to explain things more and to go deeper. So Netanyahu has been the prime minister, as I said, for 20 years. He has been dealing with so many American secretaries of state. And he used to say to them a similar thing. Whenever they came to him and said, hey, we need you to make some concession because we need a two-state solution. And on paper, by the way, Netanyahu supports the two-state solution. He had this line. He said to them, test me. I'm for two-state solutions, but test me. Make me an offer. Present me with a proposal that will ensure the security of the Jews in Israel, and I will agree to have a Palestinian state alongside of Israel. And of course, people came with different suggestions, and none of them was sufficient. And now Netanyahu has the dream team. I don't know much about sports, but when I was in high school in Israel, for some reason we followed the NBA, and we used to have this fantasy of creating the dream team. So you can tell when it was, when on the dream team we had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Larry Bird. That was the time, and later on, that's where I was a little bit older, Michael Jordan, right? So if you have all these players on your team, you can do anything you want. Netanyahu got it. He had Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner is an Orthodox Jew who, when it comes to Israeli issues, is and has been and comes from a family who is on the right. Big supporters of Netanyahu and his policy. And more than that, David Friedman, the American ambassador to Israel, is even right off Bibi when it comes to Israeli politics, to Middle East politics. He's a big supporter of the settlements, he even donates money to the settlements. Okay, so he has his people. When they come to visit, it's like you come to your favorite cousin's house. You can do whatever you want. Everyone is so happy. There is this connection that transcends completely diplomacy and politics. This is a family. So Kushner and Friedman came to Bibi and say to him, you always tell the secretaries of state, test me. We're going to do it differently. We believe, because Trump believes, that two-state solution is the way to go. And you, Bibi, said on numerous occasions that two-state solution, meaning a Palestinian state and a Jewish state, this is the way to go and to settle the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. We tell you now, you tell us what you need to make it happen. We're not going to give you a plan. You are going to give us a plan. Tell us what you need, what would secure the Jewish state, and this is going to be the core of the peace agreement. Remember the plan of the century, the peace agreement that Trump promised and the administration. So that was the idea behind it. Instead of coming to Israel with a plan, knowing that Israel definitely under Bibi Netanyahu would reject, they said, you come up with a plan, and this is more or less going to be our plan. So Netanyahu wrote a plan. And in his plan, he said, I need to annex 30% of the West Bank and many other things, and I can have a Palestinian state, or they can have a Palestinian state, on 70% of the West Bank. And of course, it's not going to be just like a nice pie when you cut a third or something. It's going to be like you, Gali, eating ice cream and taking all the good stuff because you don't like the ice cream. So all these Ben and Jerry's that after Gali we have only ice cream and no. So many little holes there but forget about it. 30%. And Friedman and Kushner, again, with the blessing, of course, of the president, said, that's a plan. Predictably, the Palestinians rejected it. I just want to remind you that the previous offer on the table, the famous or infamous Camp David Accord between the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, Bill Clinton, and Yasser Arafat, what they offered Arafat was more than 95%, and he rejected it. Okay, so now they offer Mahmoud Abbas, the current leader of the Palestinians, 70%. He rejected it. No big shock here. But one thing that people did not really pay attention to, Israel did not agree to it either. Because even though Bibi Netanyahu came up with the plan, he went to his people, to his base, right? And in Israel today, I have to tell you, there is almost no left. So it's just, I said it in a previous lecture, different shades of right. So if you think about the spectrum, in the middle, so about 1/4 to the right, you have Bibi. Those who oppose him are a little bit left of him, but are still right of center. So he went to his people who are even right of him and said, that's a plan. We'll never get a better deal than that. We have the best friend we ever had here, and we need it. This is our opportunity, and we need to make Trump happy. And they said to him, you said 70%? You want to give the Palestinians 70% of the West Bank for a state? We are going to make you a counteroffer. We're willing to give you 0% and see what you can do with it. So Bibi was in a bad situation. He came up with the plan that he said would be the best for Israel, but he couldn't deliver. He couldn't get the support, and because of his personal criminal issues, he has very little leverage. He needs every support he can get, because if he's not the prime minister, he's in even deeper problems than he is now. So Bibi, despite all the bravado and everything, is not a strong person right now. So Israel did not accept it because there was no majority for that. Some of us read the plan. I did, and we had even a class, we analyzed it. And when you read this plan, it's very plausible that Israel can start to annex these 30% of the West Bank even without agreeing to the plan. Okay? That was not necessarily the spirit of this agreement, but that's a very plausible reading. So the ambassador, David Friedman, the American ambassador to Israel, went to Bibi and said, okay, Bibi, the Palestinians said no, you're probably going to say no, but it doesn't mean that you cannot annex 30% of the West Bank. Start doing it. Forget about an agreement. And Bibi if you remember, announced that he was going to annex the West Bank. It was a big thing, right? Big news. Only that even though Friedman said you can do it, Kushner and Trump said, nice try, but no. Said, you cannot do it. Because we, America, still cares about the American interest. We love you, but we want to get something from it. And if you just annex a third of the West Bank without giving us what we need, meaning a peace agreement, we're just going to have even more conflicts around the world without getting anything from it. And they told him no. Now Bibi is in a very bad place. He found himself on a very high tree with this huge proclamation about annexing the West Bank. Trump said no. What would he do? And here comes a very colorful person. His name is Al-Taibe. And he is Al-Taibe. And he is the EAU's ambassador to the United States. When you read a little bit about the Gulf states, everyone who gets a nice position comes from a very influential family. They're all multi-billionaires, of course. And being the ambassador to the US is a very big deal. He's a young man, very bright, very shrewd. He heard about this predicament, and he came up with a brilliant idea. He got Israel and the US together and said, I understand the problem. You, Bibi, said you want to annex the West Bank. Trump says no. Here's the deal. You're going to say that you are not annexing it, or just don't do it. I don't think that Bibi ever said he wouldn't do it. He just didn't do it. He gave a date, and when the date came, nothing happened. And then we waited a few more days, and nothing happened. And still, almost a year later, nothing happened. So it's not happening. So you're not doing it. In return, we, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, are going to normalize the relationship with Israel, something that you always wanted. Now, I mentioned it when we talked about that. Israel and the Emirates and Israel and most of the Gulf states have been having decent relationships for decades. Even 2 years ago, Israeli pilots and Emirate pilots were doing things together, but the paradigm was that until Israel settles with the Palestinians, no Arab countries will normalize, or as sometimes they call it, have peace with Israel. But the UAE said, we are going to normalize the relationship with you. Full relationship, ambassadors, everything, economy. So we can say that we help the Palestinian by preventing you from doing it. You have a nice ladder with which to climb down from this high tree. President Trump, of course, will say that he did not achieve a peace in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians, but there is a great agreement between Israel and the UAE, and it was very clear that if the UAE would be doing it, other Gulf states will quickly join. And here's the thing, and we will get the toy that we always wanted, but with all the money we have, we couldn't buy it because of you, Israel. The best combat airplane in the world, F-35. Because America did not sell it to them because Israel objected. It's not that Israel has any legal status, but it is the principle that Israel always have to have a quantitative edge over all the Arab countries. So Israel always has to have the newest, most sophisticated weapon that the others will not get. And the EAU wanted these airplanes very much, and that was a secret part of the agreement, but as you know, there are never secrets. And everyone was happy. So they got their planes, Israel got the peace agreement, and it has a lot of potential, economic and militarily and some others, and Trump was very happy before election, and that was just the beginning. Okay, that's quite a good story. Who are the losers from it? It's important to know, because we're getting there. First of all, of course, the Palestinians. They're always the losers. Because what the EAU basically said to them was, we love you guys, but, for 72 years you've been fighting, and we're not going to wait. So we'll help you. They want annex. We'll give you some money maybe, but we need to move on. The world is big. We benefit from good relationship with Israel, and even more than that, with good relationship with the Trump administration. Sorry, guys. Okay? And they again felt that nobody cares about them. Turkey did not like it, but sorry, no time to talk too much about Turkey. Iran, and I'm getting to the most important part of my talk, hated it. Because Iran and Israel have not been friends. Israel, you know what? Before I continue with Iran, because I want to end with Iran and to dedicate as much time as needed. So before that, what would Biden do with all these relationships? By the way, after EAU, as we expected, Bahrain joined and Sudan joined. So what about Saudi Arabia, who is the most important country in the region? Last week, or maybe 10 days ago, I don't remember, if you read that Benjamin Netanyahu met with Pompeo in Saudi Arabia. The idea was for them to try to get an agreement for a fourth Arab country to normalize the relationship with Israel. It didn't work out. The Saudis said no. Why did they say no? I'll give you two small answers and the bigger one that is more related to our subject. First of all, the timeline in the desert is different. I don't know if you spend time in the desert, but every day looks like the previous day and the next day. So there are so many idioms about take your time. So you go to the desert, and a Bedouin can sip his coffee for 4 hours and smoke his hookah for 10 hours. You take your time. No reason to rush. Okay? They don't have election every 4 years and mid-election every 2 years, or in Israel, 4 elections in 2 years. Things stay the same, so why rushing, right? So even though we need it, or we want things to work so hard, so fast, not them. Another thing, and I talk about it because it's a very important opportunity to talk about MBS, Mohammed bin Salem, who is the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. We hear about him, we read about him, he's a big celebrity, but his power is limited. He has done several important reforms. I mentioned a few about women, some other things, and he really has a desire to play in the big world, not just in the desert. He has all the money in the world, he has all the relationship, the education, and the young people there support him. They like him. He's in his 30s. They want to move on. They're sick and tired of being isolated. But there are the older people there who do not see things the way he does. For them, the Palestinians are still a very important cause, and before Israel has an agreement with the Palestinians, they should not normalize the relationship with Israel. It's important to say, by the way, that without the Saudis' a consent, in my opinion, the EAU wouldn't have had any agreement with Israel. And the proof is that now when there are direct flights from Israel to the EAU and to Bahrain, they fly over Saudi Arabia. Okay, so they had to, not just to be in the picture, but to agree. The other reason is there's still a king. MBS is just the crown prince, is not a king. And you have to know something about kings in Arab monarchies, like in Jordan, like there. If they want to change the next leader, the next crown prince, all they need is a piece of paper and a pen. And they write, so-and-so is no longer the crown prince, and they write a different name. That's all it takes. So until almost his final death, King Hussein from Jordan, everyone knew that his brother was going to be the next king of Jordan. As he was dying in a hospital in the United States of cancer, he did what I said. He took a piece of paper and said, no, my son is the new crown prince, he's going to be the next king. That's all it takes, right? There are no hearings, there is no Congress, there is no Senate, there is nothing. That's it. So to be the crown prince does not mean that you can do whatever you want, because if you piss your father too much, you're out. And even the king had a different crown prince before MBS, that he changed his mind, okay? So things like that can happen, especially when you are the crown prince, such a young person with no experience, surrounded by people who are older, and in the Arab society, older is an advantage. There is a lot of respect and dignity by being older, okay? And these people did a lot. They were ambassadors, they were ministers, they were generals in the army, they were CEOs of huge companies, and this guy has done nothing. Okay, so there are many more people who probably have more merit than he is to be the next king of Saudi Arabia, so he's quite limited. So yeah, he's a celebrity and we like his initial, the MBS and the whole thing, but he can lose it all in a second and he has absolutely nothing to do about it. So he has to play safe. But the real reason is that I believe that when he said no to normalization with Israel, what he meant to say was not yet. What he meant to say is that, sorry guys, to Pompeo and to Bibi, there is a new sheriff in town now. Why should I do something for Trump, who has, 50 more days? I need to ingratiate myself to the new one, to Biden, especially since Biden is not happy with me anyway. Remember Khashoggi, the journalist who was killed, who was murdered by them in Turkey? The US didn't do anything against him by doing it, okay? And I mentioned the killing in Yemen and some other things. So they need to have some good points in order for Biden to like them. So why? I'm not cynical, but that's politics. So you, Mr. Trump, were really nice to us, but you're no longer the president in 50 days. We need to save it because probably Joe Biden also wants some nice picture on the lawn of the White House signing a peace agreement. Why giving it to you? And everyone who knows something about politics, I mean, that's politics. Maybe not nice, but that's what I think would happen. But I really think that very soon Israel will have a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia. And Biden will get the credit for that. Biden, by the way, when he heard about the peace agreements with EAU and Bahrain, he did the right thing. He said that that's a wonderful achievement for Trump. I'm sure that it pained him to do it, especially so close to the election. But is not going to reverse it or anything like that. Let's talk about Iran. Iran is the scariest thing right now, and we have to understand it and to know what to expect. So Iran was really upset when Israel signed these agreements with, by now, two Gulf states. 10 years ago, Israel assassinated several scientists, nuclear scientists there. 2018, only 2 years ago, I don't know if you paid attention, Israel did something that is unbelievable. But the stories that I'm telling you sound, many of them, like I just made them all up because they're too good to be true. Israelis went to Iran and stole all the data, all the documents about their nuclear plan. It's unbelievable when you read about it. They went there with these special torches, like a laser thing that my kids know more about than I do, cut openings in all the safes, and left with all the documents that Iran had, 2018. You know what happened a week later? Trump withdrew from the nuclear agreement with Iran. Okay? This agreement that was signed in 2015, there were several states, but President Obama signed, and he gets the credit or the opposite of credit for that. And Trump said from the beginning, and he followed up on what he said, 2 years into his tenure, he withdrew from it. Not only that he withdrew from it, he laid severe economic sanctions on Iran, and then he added more. And he's probably going to add even more in the short time that he is left. It crippled the Iranian economy. But one thing I wanted to know, it did not destroy Iran. So people who say, oh, Iran is very far from being destroyed. Never underestimate your enemies, especially Iran. There are many new, almost made-up states in the Middle East, like Jordan, like Iraq, like Syria. It's all these remnants of some European, the Sykes-Picot agreements between the French, the German, the Brits, not Iran. The Iranian or the Farsi empire has been around for thousands of years. They're smart people. They're shrewd people, okay? So never forget it. In any case, Israel was able to do that. And last Friday, Israel did something really, again, unbelievable. When you read, of course, nobody knows for sure, but Israel was able to assassinate Fakhrizadeh, the founder, the father of the nuclear doctrine, the nuclear plan, the most senior scientist, nuclear scientist in Iran. And what happened probably is that somehow 12 Israeli people just got the intelligence where he was going to his other house and killed him and left Iran without being caught. Try to think about the humiliation. You know how hurt it is when your arch enemy can do whatever they want in your country. They can steal your document, they can kill your scientists. They are very unhappy people. And they said that they would respond. And that's something that we need a little bit to talk about. When are they going to respond? I don't think that they will before January 20th. Because their conclusion right now, and again, maybe I'm wrong, or when we say Iran, don't think that there is one person in Iran who calls all the shots. Yes, there is Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the main religious leader, but we have President Rouhani, we had the revolution guards, we have many different forces there. Okay, so it's not like one monolithic state. That's, by the way, why Israel has this advantage and is capable to do things, because there are too many players there that Israel knows how to use the discrepancy and their rivalries. They think that Israel did it. Yeah, I'm getting a sign that I have a few more minutes. They think that Israel killed Fakhrizadeh, so they will attack Israel or some Western country, and then they will give Donald Trump a reason to attack Iran. If you remember, it was less than 2 weeks ago, we read in the papers that Trump called Pompeo and other people and said, can I just attack Iran? And as much as the people with whom he spoke wanted to attack Iran, he said, you cannot do it. We're not ready. You cannot just go and launch a war against Iran. But if he's forced to do something, and Israel will, maybe. So I don't think that they are going to do it before January 20th, but who knows? I'll take 2 more minutes and I'll end here. So the nuclear thing, Biden said that he will go back to Obama's, said Obama, it's not fair, but it was during the Obama time, to the nuclear deal from 2015. I hope he wouldn't. Not in the way that it was written 5 years ago. I understand why it was signed back then, but 5 years later, this is not a good agreement at all. Since America withdrew, now the Iranians have 12 times more enriched uranium. It has new centrifuges that they have somehow to get rid of. The Iranian, by the way, said that if you want us back in the agreement, not only that you have to lift the sanctions, you also have to pay us $250 billion in compensation. All the money that we lost because of your sanctions, etc. But forget about the nuclear weapon right now. I'm not so optimistic as some people are, who think that they'll never use it, even if they have it. But I do believe that Israel will not allow them to have it. So if they get really close to having it, it will be destroyed. Israel did it in Iraq. Israel did it in Syria. Israel will do it again in Iran. Not something that Israel wants to do, because it may escalate into something really ugly and dangerous and costly, but I don't believe that Israel will allow its citizens to go to bed knowing that these crazy ayatollahs can push a button and in a few minutes a nuclear bomb will explode in Tel Aviv. And Israel has the capability, probably even with Biden's administration and help, it will happen. What worries me more than anything else is the new missiles that Iran has. September 14th, 2019, now remember the date, September 14th, not because I'm so good in dates, that's our anniversary. So in honor of our anniversary, the Iranians attacked some oil distilleries, refineries in Saudi Arabia. For a few days, the Saudis lost half of their capacity. It was quite serious. The Saudis did not do anything. They're afraid of Iran, and they know Iran, let them do it once in a while, and they'll be okay. America did not do anything. Some say that Saudis asked America not to do anything. But when you saw the new missiles that they use, the precision, the accuracy, the quality, it caught Israel and the United States completely unprepared. So when everyone was talking for years about the nuclear problem, they were able to develop these highly sophisticated missiles. More than that, January 3rd, 2020, not our anniversary, the United States eliminated or killed Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, who was one of the most important Iranian generals, the head of the Al-Quds brigades. The Iranians said, as they always say, right, we take the time, we will react when we want, where we want. And a few months later, we read about a little attack on an American base in Iraq. Remember that? Didn't get too much, yeah, because few American soldiers got injured, nobody got killed. Oh well. However, a few months later, when we got more information, we saw that things were much worse. All these soldiers, or 64 of them, I'm sorry, had some serious brain damage. And when they looked at the missiles and the drones that the Iranians used, that's scary stuff. When the American soldiers described, they had bunkers because that were good for these Katyusha type, for these little rockets. They were not prepared to the sophistication of the weapon and the attack. I'll just give you an example. I know I'm running out of time. They waited, and the first time they launched it at 6, 7 o'clock. After, by the way, they gave them a warning of an hour. They called the Iraqis, said, in an hour we're going to bomb this base. And Americans went, bunkers, the whole thing. And then at 4 a.m., when the Americans thought that it was over and left the bunkers, they launched new missiles. Now, they have these missiles, and not only that they can launch not only from Iran, but the expertise of Iran is not what they can do there, but their proxy armies or their proxy wars. Because they control Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is the biggest non-official army in the world. Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles. Most of them are dumb missiles, but many of them can easily hit Israel. Iran now controls, or is going to completely control, big parts of Syria. Just try to imagine the border of Israel, right? So Lebanon is in the north, Syria is in the northeast, Iran is there. Iran has a major influence on the Islamic Jihad in Gaza, in the south of Israel. And I'm not talking now about Iraq and Yemen and some other things where they control. So I have to end here. I'll just tell you that if there is, of course, Biden is now not doing anything but listening to my talk, but if I can deliver one message, if the U.S. is going to sign any agreement with Iran, they should not limit it to only nuclear bombs. They must include the missile program of Iran. Because what's going to destroy or at least hurt Israel significantly is not likely to be a nuclear bomb. It's going to be one of these sophisticated, with high precision missiles that can be shot from Iran, from Lebanon, from Syria, and perhaps even from Gaza. There is tons of more to talk about. Do we have no question? That's good. If you want to ask me questions online, or if there is any desire to continue this kind of conversations in the future, I would love to do it. I don't want to do it, for example, monthly, but whenever something is worth talking about, I will send you emails, put it in the scribe if there is time. And many people told me that they like the time of Friday at 6. So we'll try. Please send me comments and suggestions or anything you want. Thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully I contributed something to your understanding of the region and what's happening. And in 58 seconds, we continue with Shabbat. I apologize to my colleagues and friends here who were supposed to start services much earlier. So let's